I've had the 6 Ubuntu's 16.04 on my external and internal drives long enough to form an initial opinion of what I think of them, so I've decided to rank them in various categories. I concede at the outset that this is highly subjective and it may not reflect the way you think about them or work on your computer at all, but it reflects the way I work. First, in terms of ease of use, I gave Ubuntu Mate first place because by default it comes configured exactly the way I like my desktops configured. This is probably no surprise since I'm used to working with GNOME 2 and this is basically GNOME 2. However, in every other respect it's also easy to use because it appears that the developers care about the user, which is not true of some of the other distributions. I give Ubuntu second place. It can easily be configured the way I like, but it takes a while to configure it, so I put it in second. Kubuntu is third. Again, it can be configured. It's a little more difficult to configure, and some of the techniques with Kubuntu are not exactly discernible without some practice. I gave Lubuntu fourth place. It's almost what I like. It really lacks one thing, and that is window snaps. I find them very helpful in saving time. I put Ubuntu GNOME next, although that and Ubuntu could switch places. Actually, by default, Ubuntu is just a little bit easier to use, but since GNOME can be configured extensively and Ubuntu cannot, I gave GNOME the edge. And when it comes to configurability, Kubuntu gets my nod for first place. There's almost nothing you can't do with it to configure and reconfigure it. Ubuntu Mate is second. It doesn't have quite the extensive range of configurations, but it's easy to configure. And Xubuntu is third. It's almost as easy to configure as Ubuntu Mate, but since I have to do less configuration with Mate, I gave that the edge. Lubuntu is fourth. It's just about as easy to configure again as Xubuntu. There are a few things that are a little harder to do in Lubuntu, but you can do them. And Ubuntu GNOME has a lot of tweak tools, some of which are available as it is packaged, and some of which you have to go online to get. There's still some things you can't do with it. You can make up for a lot of the deficits of the original GNOME 3, however. And Ubuntu, unfortunately, with the Unity desktop is last because it can hardly be configured at all. There is a tweak tool, but there are certain things that I like that you just can't get with Ubuntu and the Unity desktop. For instance, a task list of open windows at the bottom of the screen. You just can't get it. I must say at the outset that this release of the Ubuntus is the buggiest I have ever experienced, and I've been using it since 9.04. However, Ubuntu itself is fairly good. I haven't had any problems with it at all. I've had a few problems with Ubuntu GNOME and a few more with Lubuntu. With Ubuntu Mate, I keep getting these notices that, oops, something internal has gone wrong. I don't really know what to do about it except report it, but I haven't had any real crashes. The other thing I would say about Mate is that the network manager just didn't work when I installed it. And I was able to get it work with some difficulty after installation, but I wonder whether a novice to Linux would be able to do that easily. The same thing is true of Ubuntu. The network manager didn't work on installation, and I had the same trouble getting that going. I've had a few other problems with it, but I've never had anything crash completely. I will say in reference that one of the prominent commentators on Ubuntu had a very bad crash with Ubuntu following an update and lost all of his data. Fortunately, he had a backup. I did not have that problem. I've made all the updates and I haven't had a similar problem. However, just because I didn't doesn't mean that you won't. I put Kubuntu in last place. The Plasma 5.5 desktop is still under development and isn't quite perfect. For instance, when I scanned a document using their scanning utility, what came out was complete gibberish. And when I opened their software manager, text didn't stop where it was supposed to stop. It kept bleeding into other parts of the pictures. I've also had a few points when it just stopped working. However, I personally haven't had any disastrous crashes and haven't lost any data with any of the Ubuntus. Now, with lowest resource use, I don't think it's any surprise that Ubuntu came in first. Mate came in second, and Ubuntu came in third. I was quite surprised that Ubuntu with the Unity desktop came in fourth, and Kubuntu came in fifth, ahead of where it would have been last time, with Ubuntu GNOME bringing up the rear. Now, this is what I used to come to these conclusions. I looked at the RAM usage in megabytes when the desktop only was visible. Secondly, when Firefox was running and the Google search page was on, the blank page with the search windows. That's my home page. And third, when Firefox was running and a YouTube video was playing. The order of these would have been different if I had chosen one of the first two categories, but I used the last category in ranking them. Actually, Kubuntu was a little better than Ubuntu in desktop only and Firefox just with the Google search page. However, it was a little worse with the YouTube video running, and I figured that was the most extreme condition. By advanced utilities, I'm referring mostly to the GNOME utilities that come with Ubuntu and Unity Desktop and Ubuntu GNOME. Ubuntu adds a few touches to these utilities. That's why I put it in first place. Theoretically, all of the Ubuntu should have access to the same software, but in practice, some of them don't work very well with the GNOME utilities. They weren't really intended to work with them, so it's hard to fault them, but I'm just pointing out a fact. Now, Kubuntu has a lot of its own utilities, the KDE utilities, which are different from the GNOME utilities, and some of them are very good. I put it third because some of them I don't particularly like. However, some of them are superior. For instance, the Dolphin file manager is far superior to anything in Ubuntu GNOME. I put Ubuntu Mate fourth because it doesn't run some of the GNOME utilities quite as well as GNOME itself does. In a sense, I don't expect it to, but I'm just reflecting reality. And Ubuntu I put fifth. It doesn't run the utilities very well either. And Ubuntu I put sixth. Things like the voice recorder just don't work, at least for me, in Ubuntu, but they work in Ubuntu GNOME. with package management, it's really hard to beat Ubuntu Mate with the software boutique and the apt grid. I just can't imagine anything better than those two. They also, of course, have the GNOME package manager and the old Ubuntu package manager for those who wish to use them. Ubuntu GNOME I put in second. Actually, GNOME and regular Ubuntu with the Unity desktop are very, very close in this category, but since the GNOME package manager was developed first in GNOME, I gave it a slight edge. Kubuntu has a pretty good package manager of its own. It's a bit buggy, as I mentioned, and not quite as easy to use as some of the others, but it's fairly good. Xubuntu uses the GNOME package manager just like Ubuntu and Ubuntu GNOME do. And Lubuntu has its own package manager, which it's had for some time, which is quite serviceable, perhaps not quite as nice. I should point out that all of them can use the apt-get commands in the terminal, as well as the abbreviated apt commands and the snap commands. And they all have Synaptic Package Manager available, although it's not installed by default. Now, graphic design may not be very important to some people, and again, this is highly subjective because what I like, you may not like at all, but I thought I would include it because there is quite a difference. I think Kubuntu is just lovely. It's a pleasure to use it for that reason, although it's not quite as much of a pleasure for some other reasons. But I give it the highest grade in graphic design, followed by Ubuntu with the Unity desktop and Ubuntu GNOME. I would rank Ubuntu Mate fourth. It's not ugly, but it's sort of ho-hum. Xubuntu is a little more ho-hum even than that, and Lubuntu brings up the rear. Although all of these distributions can be tweaked and the appearance changed, so it would be fairly simple to take Lubuntu, for instance, and make something really beautiful out of it. It just doesn't come that way. So finally I come to an overall ranking. This was highly unscientific, so one shouldn't take these numbers too seriously. There were 7 categories, and the highest rank would have been 70. The lowest rank would have been 35. I gave Ubuntu Mate the first place, and again, this was just adding up the scores from my previous reviews. I didn't do anything but add them up. Ubuntu comes in second, tied with Kubuntu. The reason I gave Ubuntu the edge over Kubuntu is that Kubuntu is a little bit buggier. Then Ubuntu GNOME comes in fourth, Xubuntu came in fifth, and Lubuntu came in sixth. This is XRAM Tech. Thanks for watching.